Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get us started because we have a good bit of stuff to cover. Thank you for braving the cold weather, the snow. And if anybody wants to give me a ride home afterwards, I'd appreciate it. After North Carolinian and snow, wish us luck. We are going to continue. This is our second part of a multiple part experience, and we're going to be going through. 2 weeks ago, we talked about began to share a vision for the cathedral for the coming season in our life. And now these are some practical things we're going to look at. Got a lot of ground to cover, so Jen going to try to get through it and then hold questions for the end. Generally, I'm not going to recover the stuff we did last week because it is available to you. Scott is monitoring the Zoom. I can't actually see the Zoom just because of things and technology. So if you need to get a hold of us, Scott is the one to reach out to. So remember that everything we do today, just as what was done 2 weeks ago, is available online, both the PowerPoint and the Zoom, the session itself. So we talked about Trinity Cathedral as a sacred place for all people. We're remembering what Bishop Leonard said 100 years ago, 115 years ago, envisioning the cathedral as a place to open doors wide enough for the religious ingatherings of many, whether churchless or creedless, capacious in its intention, socially a great civic and moral, as well as ecclesiastical church. So a setting both for civic witness, a door open to everyone, but also a Christian church where we live out a witness that comes from our Christian wisdom tradition. And doors to be open to everyone, especially those who have no particular church home, that they may gladly say, this is our church and I have a right to it. And from that, we see a thread that it really has gone through the cathedral these many years, and I think has a lot to do with brought each and every one of us to this place. Trinity Cathedral, a sacred place for all people. We identified core values: integrity, meaning we are who we say we are in all areas of our life. Dignity, respecting the dignity of every human being is clearly a core value of this place. Faithfulness, that comes from our love of God and one another. We show up to do the work that we are called to do. Continuity, which connects us not just to a cathedral that was built 115 years ago, but I believe connects us to throughout history, looking at the early church, the practices of the church that took shape before Western Christianity took shape. That we go back and we can draw some really beautiful things to draw upon. Also, a continuity connects us over these past 115 years. Last week, what came up in a couple places was, what about our witness during the life era? That's continuity too. All of this threads our witness together and is a part of who we are today. And finally, transcendence, meaning we come to the cathedral to experience something sacred. That means something a little different to each and every one of us. There are different expressions of that. To be a little bit playful, very rarely do people come to Trinity because coffee's pretty good, right? We come because there's something gorgeous. We hope there's good coffee too. That's important. But we come because there's something really special about this place. Not only the architecture, not only the music, but the people, the witness, the story, the voice, all of these things. We talked about where we are in the life cycle of our congregation today. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I am going to just quickly go back over it once again. Reminder, churches move not in years, but in decades. And that oftentimes we plant seeds that will bear fruit 10, 20 years down the road. So the fruit that we're plucking today is often because of seeds that was planted before. So if we look at the last 30 years, a reminder of the first decade was a period of steady growth. The second decade was more expansive growth. The third decade was more, we would call that stagnation. That's probably the proper term, though we didn't necessarily see or name it as such. And then we got to the interim, which was a period of challenge. The reason why we look at this is because there's always more nuance to the story than we think. It also is a reminder that our work is not just to continue to do things exactly as they were before, and that sometimes it's a season to try new things and change some things, which we never like to do. But I would remind us that to me, this life cycle tells us that now is a really good time to be engaging some carefully planned and thoughtful new things. And we're going to focus in 3 areas. 1, Trinity Commons, establishing Trinity Commons, which I think is very much in line with how it was initially envisioned when it was built, as a place for programming that inspires, nourishes, and celebrates the image of God in all people. Trinity Congregation, we will grow in number and diversity as a hub of formation, community, and service for children, youth, and young adults of all ages. And campus engagement. We'll establish Trinity as a place of spirituality and respite for students, a church home for those seeking it, and an integral community partner in the eyes of CSU administration and students. Now, the little bit of vocabulary. We're using the word strategic vision rather than strategic plan. One sec. A little hot chocolate, a little water, a little tea, who knows? Why use this word instead of a strategic plan? Because we're probably all used to hearing about strategic plans, right? Well, I learned a little bit of interesting history of the strategic plan. It emerged from World War II as a way of tactical planning when navigating a complex, what one might call a wicked problem with lots of moving pieces. So if you are invading Normandy, you want to have a really good strategic plan for how you are going to accomplish that. Doesn't mean you can control all the variables in the theater, but you do need to plan really carefully ahead of time. It was then taken after World War II, it found its way, this idea of the strategic plan, into corporate planning. So it really found its way into corporate America. And so to some extent, it's designed for some level of hierarchy as a dominant paradigm. And the question for us is, planning is really good, strategy is really good, but how much of that works for a church that, while yes, there is some hierarchy, this is not a command and control structure, right? For a strategic plan to really work, you need 1, a visible and stable environment. Well, no, we really don't have that. It's somewhat visible, hopefully transparent, but I haven't experienced a whole lot of stability in the last few years, perhaps you have. And then a command and control structure. Right? Not so much. It doesn't quite work that way. We are the church together. So rather, we're using the language, a strategic vision, trying to create a dynamic structure, something that draws on core values, on our history, as well as today's opportunities and resources, to offer a supportive framework in which the vision continues to be shaped in an ongoing way. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about staff structure. This is work that is ongoing, and really the most substantial piece of this work has already been done. Over the last year and a half, we've been looking really carefully at our structure. We have convened an organizational architecture committee of the vestry with some help outside the vestry. That was Kim De Niro Aykroyd, Gary Benjamin, Patty Roberts, Mark Biddlestone, and me. We said, is our staff structure helping us, hurting us? Is it the right thing? And in all things that worked well a handful of years ago may have been just fine, but for whatever reason may not be working quite as well. And so we interviewed, and we were particularly looking at our finance and administrative staff. That was the guiding question, but it led us into some other places as well. So we interviewed other cathedrals, and we talked to cohort churches, churches that were a similar size, a similar mission, a similar dynamic, places all over the country. Churches that were larger, we didn't really talk to many that were smaller than Trinity, but we looked at those that were comparable, if not, as much as, 2 times as large. And we also reviewed our current positions and our job descriptions. And we learned some things. We learned, first of all, we learned that Trinity had, compared to these others, a smaller pastoral and program staff, while having larger administrative and finance staff. We learned that we had within our core structure positions that had grown over the years outside the vestry's purview. We had some internal administrative processes, budgeting, finance, and some less than clear job descriptions that we found them to be cumbersome and energy intensive. And many of you I see who are on the vestry or on Cathedral Council, many who have been on vestry or Cathedral Council will probably not be shocked, because I think some of these sort of came up. And what we did is this afforded us an opportunity to talk to other cathedrals and churches and say, how do you structure what you're doing? Because we have these questions that are raising. We also, and this is actually going back about a year and a half ago, we sat down with about 8 ministry leaders, some of whom were on the vestry, some had been and some were not, and really just asked what their candid thoughts were about what was working and what wasn't working in terms of this structure. So we, from that, we did some work redesigning our finance and administrative structure in order to align with what we were seeing was working well in other places. That led to the creation of the controller position. That's Dan Hout-Riley, that in August 2021. That has been working quite well. Dan has been pretty much hired. He specifically handles our finance structures, and he only handles our finance stuff. That's a difference from before, where it was spread out over a number of staff positions. So we reduced that to 1 person, and it has been going quite well. And Dan, of course, is a great colleague and a great staff member. It also means looking at all of our staff positions and saying, what are we asking them to do, from dean to controller to communications manager to everybody, and really looking at how are we focusing our work towards growth. Doesn't mean that growth is always going to happen, but it does mean that there are things that we can do as the staff to really focus our efforts on continuing to expand our impact and our participation. So that means, first of all, we are seeking a director of children's and youth ministry. We have gone through a number of iterations over the last few years. That has been very challenging, and we know that's been tough on children, youth, and their families. It's also been just challenging to do this in the pandemic. A great many churches are struggling with youth ministry because of the pandemic. There's just no way around that. And so what we see across the board is churches that have kind of gone to, much smaller programs in this season. But by talking to, Adrian and I spoke with, reached out to every single family with children and youth to offer a conversation. We had some very good ones about what are you hoping for, what's missing, what do you love about the cathedral, what do we want to grow? And we believe that we have not only enough participation, and we find that when we do things well, people show up and say, I want to bring my kids to the cathedral. And so we want to build on that. We think this is a great time, and we're going to begin by searching for a children's and youth director. We're going to look for a full-time person, but sometimes in this position, you actually find someone who might have something else going on, and you need to divide it among several part-timers. So we'll just see what happens in the search process, but ideally, we'd like to find a full-time person to help us anchor and build a program. We are discerning a director of program for Trinity Commons. That means whereas one of the first of those positions, we pretty much have a ready to go to market with it. This means a little bit more work, a little bit more conversation. I'm really enjoying my time in Leadership Cleveland, but that's also giving me a lot of time to listen to what the needs are within the wider Cleveland community. How can we be a church that meets that in this public-facing space? So a lot of conversation to be had, but this is what we are missing, we think, in terms of making the Commons a much more engaged and intentionally programmed area of focus for us. We've been doing it over the years, but more or less catch as catch can, as various staff members have the availability or the good fortune to learn of opportunities. We'd like to intentionally have someone on staff focus on that. And then I call it in the hopper down the road. We have no specific plans, but I think we could certainly articulate a need for a director of development as well as an additional priest associate. This is getting back to that. The point is that Trinity has a smaller program and pastoral staff than most comparable churches, cathedrals our size. There's obviously a lot of factors around that, including what our financial capacity is, all things to bear in mind. But I think it's good to have these in the back of our minds as places that can these positions help us to grow. So that's our staff. Just a little bit about worship and liturgy. First of all, we had, I think, really wonderful conversations early in the fall as we prepared to return to 3 services, community conversations. The idea was to really get at, it's that question of core values again. What's at the core of every time we walk into worship, whatever the different expression is, but we also had time in those conversations to say what is important to us about the 5, the 11:15, the 9, the evensong, the 8 a.m., to really kind of get at that. And simply put, we want to continue. This is transcendence. And this is transcendence in multiple different ways. So celebrate both the distinctiveness and the unity that binds us together. So every service has something special about it, but there's also a thread that brings it all together. Several years ago, I'm still looking for the document again. Someone did a wonderful study in 2015. So wonderful, they never did it again. I wish they would. Where they looked at churches that were across the country, churches that were growing and churches that were declining. And it wasn't to say, this is what works, but it did say churches that are growing tend to have this happen. Churches that are declining tend to have that happening. So churches that have a clear sense of vision and who they are, doesn't matter what that vision is, but the point is if they have that, they tend to be growing. Churches that have a visible presence of children, doesn't have to be huge, but it has to be visible, tend to be growing. Those that do not have that tend to be declining. Churches that have multiple expressions of liturgy tend to be growing. Churches that have one service tend not to be. And then just for fun, churches that tend to be growing tend to have drums. So you can read into that however you want. They just looked at the evidence and said that churches that tend to be growing tend to have drums, which means they probably have a service where there's a drum kit playing. So if you feel like, I know we all sort of have our own thing, I respect that, but if you feel a need to poo-poo the drum kit, I invite you to double your pledge and invite 4 friends. The point is, and this is what's beautiful about Trinity, is not only can we have some of the finest choral music around, we can also have other really wonderful expressions, which of course is the story that many of us know. So that means, of course, I'm only going to talk on 2 services here for now. 11:15, we are so blessed to have not 1, but 2 fabulous instruments and really strong musical leadership. People expect this from Trinity. We will continue to do that. And then at 9 a.m., such an important and distinct part of our worship life. But it does, we do have to revoice things every once in a while. If you're going to have a contemporary expression, you really need to retool it, I think, every 5 or 10 years so that it can remain current. And we haven't done that in quite some time. And this is not news, this is stuff I've shared in the past, is to take what we have and focus less on jazz, because jazz is sometimes harder to sing, but rather let's think a little bit more open about it and say what matters is a strong rhythm, a full sound, and having the congregation as the primary instrument. There's a lot of space within that for jazz. There's a lot of space within that for other expressions. But the point is that I think that allows a sound that will continue to grow. It will continue to grow. We're going to continue on, and we can come back to all of these. Communications and voice. Our website and branding, it's about 10 years old, which is a long period of time for a website. Our branding, which was, we used it in 2011, was, I think, an improvement over where we were, but also we integrated it at a kind of peak of where we were at our congregational life, right there in 2011. And I think we can learn from the fact that it has not been a period of expansion since then. So it's an opportunity just noting that, as well as the fact that after 10 years, it's time to retool the website and also understand that how people communicate is a little different from 10 years ago. So we're taking a look at that. And so we're rebuilding a new website, and we're doing some new branding work around Trinity Cathedral, a sacred place for all people, to really build a website that focuses, one, on congregational vitality. So it still needs to be a website that feels like a church website, not in terms of narrowing focus, but rather a point of engagement for us as the congregation of Trinity, while also giving us a strong public-facing presence, Trinity as Trinity Commons, and as sacred arts and music. And then finally, recognizing that we're now using a lot of digital and online content. That has really helped. We've had pretty much every Sunday since coming back to worship together in the cathedral, we have a handful of new people. And they're here because often they worship with us online during the pandemic. They see it and they come in. And so that's really exciting. Ministry structure, when we had our conversation with other cathedral churches and cohort churches, we were beginning from the place of what our staff structure is, but it quickly became clear that we needed, because oftentimes these other churches had some alignment between how their staff was structured and how their ministry was structured. And so that led us to another question, which is, how do you structure your ministries and your lay leadership? And generally, these were churches. Right now, many churches in our country are declining. Generally speaking, churches with some degree of resource, whether that's size or financial resource, tended over the last decade or so to remain stable or growing. And so we often ask these churches, like, what is it that has helped you to grow in leadership and participation? Now, I can assure you that every challenge we have here has been experienced in pretty much every church, right? So people are people, churches are churches. We can assume that. But the question is, how have you structured yourself? And what we found is that all of them have one leadership body. So we are a standout in the sense that we have two elected leadership bodies. We have Cathedral Council and we have Vestry. In these conversations, we found that 100% of the churches we talk to have the single elected leadership body. What most of them do, I'm going to say 98% because there's one or two of them that do something really kind of their own thing, have committees or networks that oversee certain ministry areas, and that is in a healthy relationship with the vestry leadership. So what we have, and this is an observation of kind of being here for 3 years and observing how things work, as well as in being in conversation with other churches. Now, remember, we have, before the pandemic, 250 people ASA. So that's exactly where we were in the year 2000. We have 2 elected bodies, which requires 24 elected members, which is a really high number. Not a high number for people in leadership, but in terms of elected leadership, it would be a high number if we had 500 on Sunday. But before the pandemic, we were 250. There's a lot of redundancy there. There's a lot of overlapping meetings. There's a lot of ministry leaders and staff. There's a lot of care and feeding of leadership bodies that there's frankly just a whole lot of overlap. And I would say a vast, and I mean that, vast amount of energy from staff and leadership to continue this structure as it's going. And the question, what's that?
A lot of meetings.
A lot of meetings, right? Chair of Cathedral Council, right? A lot of meetings that, now the bylaws don't say thou shalt have a lot of meetings, but the bylaws do give us a structure that, if we're going to keep it going, requires a lot of meetings. And I would also say that it keeps us, despite our hearts, our intentions being in the right place, and 24 passionate, committed people each and every year, it keeps us kind of accidentally inward focused. And I just want to name that. And I want to suggest hearing, not only from hearing what other churches doing, but in conversation. I brought this up at a joint vestry and cathedral council retreat. We first started talking about this in October, and listening to feedback about what we're hearing. And so this is to propose integrating ministry and governance into a single leadership structure, and give you a little bit of a peek. This is an evolving idea. Give a peek in terms of what it could be, as well as what we would have to do in order to change. So first of all, our canons place a certain responsibility on vestry. And vestry is, and this is most churches have, it's electric leadership, people, electric. Elected leadership, where vision and leadership are the responsibility of the elected board. And what we've done is we've separated governance and ministry from that conversation. Those 2 things should be at the table together. In terms of casting a vision, governance and ministry need to be there. The way it is, you kind of have to go through several different levels and then perhaps bring them all together. Rather, they should all be in conversation. Second, growth. Obviously, I like to say good organization is not necessary to salvation, but it does help more people to be involved. And it does help us to carry out what we're charged to do. And so following a pattern that we see in other cathedrals and churches that have experienced some growth over the last decade calls us to consider how we're structured. I think it's important to focus our leadership, our lay, our staff, and our clergy on mission rather than maintenance. Now, that is not meant, like, maintenance is important work. And everybody showing up to a vestry meeting or cathedral council meeting knows that that's part of what our responsibility is. When I say maintenance, I mean, I think we're maintaining a structure that may not be getting us where we want to go. And I think this is actually true across the Episcopal Church. Dioceses, lots of churches, I think, are experiencing, like, we have a lot of inherited structures that work very well at another time. And there was very good reason for them to be there. But at this point, we're in a different place. And the pandemic could really be influencing that. But positively, we want to build our community. So this is both growth and service around networks of ministry leadership. Okay, I'm going to show this to you real fast, but I'm going to come back to this. So don't worry. This is a picture of what it might look like with vestry having some standing committees. Notice you have to the question of how do we care for the ministries themselves. I would note Cathedral Ministries, this becomes a standing committee of the vestry itself. We're going to hand these out at the end. We've got a few of these as well. With networks of ministry leadership around that. So it envisions 4 standing committees. We kind of have some of this already. One is finance, Another is property and sustainability. One is stewardship, which is, according to our bylaws, a joint responsibility of vestry and cathedral council. And then finally, a cathedral's ministry committee, which offers support and guidance. Much of the function of what cathedral council already does in terms of council advice and overall support. All of this is being fleshed out, and this is why I'm offering here to bring in conversation. Some of this is borrowing from what other cathedrals and churches do, and some of this is what would be unique to Trinity. Envisioning approximately 7 mission teams. This is work that we need to continue to do, but offering leadership in various areas of our church and cathedral life to help us better focus on those 3 topics that we introduced at the very beginning. This would not be put in our bylaws. Okay, that's intentionally because we want to be minimalist in our bylaws, which is typically what we see in other cathedrals' bylaws as well. And we want to have flexibility to revise and adapt. And the point is inviting these mission teams, which would generally be a handful of at-large congregation members and leaders and a chair in there, and a staff member and a vestry representative to offer some discernment, bylaws. I said bylaws by accident. Discernment, some support, and some ability to carry out and adapt the ministry going forward. Audrey.
Of these people, who are elected?
The vestry would be elected, and then a handful of the mission teams would be nominated and appointed by the Cathedral Ministries Committee. That would serve as a nominating committee for that. So 2 more, I'm going to come to see this again graphically, and I'm going to conclude the presentation with this. Gives you a picture of how it might work. Okay, who doesn't love bylaws, right? So one of the things is our current bylaws are very specific about how we are governed, and we don't simply turn on a dime. And if we want to make a change, we would either set forth a process for the next few months, which I would suggest, or we really have to wait a year and a half, including electing new vestry and cathedral council classes to something which may or may not be something we have going forward. So this means taking a careful look at our bylaws now. So we began the conversation with vestry and cathedral council this past October. We started it at the same time with both of them. This would require a series of bylaw changes. And so we're gonna have a further presentation on what those bylaws could be in February, giving us enough time to have a vote in March of 2022. So in 2 months. We'd also like to move our annual meeting to midwinter. Our bylaws require currently that they are in May, which there's a number of reasons why that is less than ideal. Namely, we get less people there. It's also, I think, not as good a time to elect new leadership and get everybody to work, because you elect people and then you go to summer vacation and then you come back. So this is a little more typical, a midwinter. Typically churches are either in November or in late January, early February. We're proposing late January, early February. So to do this, we have to create a timeline. So in the month, February 13th, we'll consider bylaw drafts as a congregation, and as well as take a look at what some of the ministry structure updates might be. So these are 2 tracks. You don't have to create a different ministry structure to change the bylaws, but I think it helps to have an idea of where we might be headed so that we have a sense that we're still going to be carrying out this ministry. And we're not looking for less leaders, we're looking for more. If you do the math and you have 3 or 4 mission team leaders, that's more people than cathedral council, but in more of a specific area of focus. So February 16th to 23rd, hang on one sec. Do you have a quick question?
I was going to say that more or less, you have more people.
Well, the cathedral council is 12 people. This envisions at least 3 per mission team times 7. So we want more people involved in leadership, not less. We want more people participating, not less. But not elected. Wouldn't be one of the difference. So February 16th to 23rd, the proposed bylaws per our current bylaws are posted in adequate time on the bulletin board. It says in the bylaws, there must be a bulletin board. Friends, we may take that out of the bylaws if you allow us. But that's all of this. The point is, these are bylaws. This is up to the congregation. We gather on March 13th for a congregational meeting. The revised bylaws would be voted upon. We would do our annual reporting then in 2 months. And then if this moves forward, our mission teams would then be recruited. And in the fall, mission teams would discern and begin work, which pushes our next vestry elections out to an annual meeting next January and February. And I'll say just a little bit about that. Why would we push our vestry elections rather than go ahead and holding them now? It really has to do with the timeline, which that would become very fast, as well as we want to do what we can to try to create this structure the best we can. A May election, because of our bylaws, would require a slate by April 1st. To go from March 13th to April 1st means a nominating process that would be 3 weeks, which usually takes 6 to 8 weeks. That's really fast. And it takes time to discern and invite people to take time. The other is it's not a whole year. We're looking at an earlier annual meeting next year. And we think that new structures, which is what this is, can take some heavy lifting. We want to give needed time to clarify what the vestry's role here is, as well as what the mission team's role, get some practice in what works and what doesn't. And in the meantime, as spots on the vestry become available, we would appoint council co-chairs to open seats as they were available, because having them there, having Audrey and Barbara, who are council co-chairs, a part of this is really, really important. So whatever way we do to keep them in that conversation is pretty vital. So I'm going to conclude with this, and we're going to hand this out. We have a few minutes for conversation. I'm sorry, there's so many things to talk about. With just a picture loosely of what we're envisioning: mission teams of peace, justice, and mercy, which would be racial reconciliation, which could include creation care, the justice ministries of the cathedral, spiritual formation, what we think of as adult formation, Trinity neighborhood partnerships. Many churches would just have sort of one quote unquote outreach. It seems clear that Trinity has a really broad desire to be involved both in justice work and hands-on service work. And we think of Trinity neighborhood partnerships as those things that what we do by virtue of the fact that we are a church and we are here at the corner of 22nd and Euclid, and we serve Marion Sterling, and we serve a place at the table, and we serve the campus. That's neighborhood partnerships, congregational life, invite, welcome, connect. Just to remind, we see new people every Sunday. How are we threading them into the life of the church? Children and youth is vital and needs to be an important priority. And finally, worship, art, and music. Lot of space for discernment around specifics and what that looks like, but I wanted to give a broad picture. So I'm going to move straight to questions in the time that we have. I'm going to start with Debbie and then Fran.
I'm curious about the time vestry will take. The reason council was created was there was no time on vestry meetings, commission, and ministry.
Right.
So now you're doing council authority, dividing it, making it like very quick.
Mm-hmm.
What attacks, like I said, making these sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
Having more leadership, having more people involved. You were elected. Where's the time in vestry meetings?
Right.
Or to talk about those subgroups.
So there are two answers to that, and partly it's learning from what has worked in some other cathedrals. A lot of the things that a vestry or a cathedral council would talk about is probably better handled by the mission teams. And there'll be a vestry representative on this, between vestry representative and staff, and the ministry chair and leaders themselves. They're going to be able to handle a lot more than a vestry or even a cathedral council that has lots, a whole lot on their plate. However, each month there would be a different mission team would report to vestry. And so that's automatically going to happen. So spiritual formation would have every October, they're reporting to vestry. As things come up that require wider conversation, then it just goes on the agenda. But the point is there's that mechanism immediately put in, both to make sure the vestry is able to take care of their fiduciary stuff. So it's not only that, but the point is more of these kind of major decisions would hopefully be taking place among the ministry leaders themselves, but with staff and representative, vestry representatives on it.
So our online audience is requesting that if you can go up to the microphone and state your question, that would be easier for them to understand and hear.
So I'll state the question after the answer so that everybody hears it. That was that the original creation of Cathedral Council was because there wasn't being given enough time to the ministry themselves. And so how do we make sure that they are being given some time for ministry? And what? At vestry meetings. Right. Okay.
Okay, I have a problem with the focus and everything that CSU being one of the focuses.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not the local community one of the focuses. You already know the community as college church. People passing by here think we're college. There's so much that needs to be done. And we're focusing on CSU, which is a business, not the community. This is the community. Love the community. Dr. Martin Luther King believes in vision. Our designing vision has a plan that's already developed. Yet, even our Creator, Jesus Christ, loving community, he wasn't in the synagogue and evil. Why is CSU focused?
Well, okay, so the question is, why is CSU a focus when it's Fran's concern is that it does not include the Becoming Beloved community, that it is a business, and why would we support them rather than those who live in our neighborhood, or I think from earlier conversations. I think to clarify, we are not in any kind of formal relationship with CSU administration. And this is for the students. And it can be Tri-C students. It is to create a place of care and witness for those who quite literally are our neighbors, who have an opportunity to engage the sacred at a pretty important moment in their lives. And mostly what this functionally means is Adrian has been building up a lot of relationships with mostly student support groups like the LGBTQ Center on campus, creating a space of welcome for them. So that the Becoming Beloved community is really important to me as well. I don't see that as inconsistent at all, because we're caring for students who, frankly, that is our neighborhood, and give them an engagement with something really sacred that will have a lifelong impact on them. We can do Patty and then Bob. Okay. Okay. Yes, no, I cannot be specific because but it would vary by different, I would imagine that it would vary by different mission teams. So I'm sorry, the question is, can we be specific about the time commitment of the mission teams? Probably not so different from serving on council. I would say one example of where that's already working quite well is what the adult formation team is doing. So they have a committee, but they also are in conversation with other groups that are already doing their thing. There's gonna be a lot of ministries that would be kind of under one of these umbrellas, but doesn't need a lot of, I use the knitting pearls often. They're gonna keep doing their thing. Daughters of the King is gonna continue to keep doing their thing. But there are areas where some additional planning, like planning Sunday morning programming and Trinity Forum and that kind of thing, requires a little bit more. So depending on what the ministry area is, will shape how often they meet, how often they need to be getting involved to support what some of the other ministry groups are doing. So it would vary. It's probably comparable to being on Cathedral Council, but I think it depends on the ministry themselves. Well, the cathedral, what does the cathedral's role as the cathedral of the Diocese of Ohio fit into the strategic vision? I think it is the fact that it's named by Bishop Leonard as a sacred place for all people. It's an expression of the diocese. It certainly is an expression of the ministry of the bishop themselves. But if we take the Commons in the founding document of Trinity Commons, it is a shared outreach of the Diocese of Ohio and Trinity Cathedral. And this is actually pretty much going straight back to that language and saying, how do we build programming around that? And the diocese is the largest partner. We're both the same thing and partners. So that's going to create, it's going to be programming that I think supports our whole diocese. Let's use we used the example of Undesigned the Red Line several years ago. That was something that was both the diocese and the cathedral together. Well, it's obviously, we haven't developed it yet, but I think one of the first things they're going to do is sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Dorothy Miller asked, what are some of the tasks of the Trinity Commons program director? Well, I think first is to sit in relationship with every community partner we have, as well as including the diocese, as well as everybody who uses space here, to begin to say what programming is needed, whether it's spiritual formation, whether it's gathering community around particular issues, whether there are major events like Undesigned the Red Line, whether there are things like planning Martin Luther King Day events, anything that would happen, that would be the foresight of developing the relationships, as well as implementing it and then communicating it to the wider community. And I'm being staccato because I know we've only got a few minutes. Let's go to Bob and then Brant.
I was just piggybacking on Brant's question of the CSU situation. It's like you're focusing on a community that's right there, but you're not focusing on the same community that's 3 blocks that way and 3 blocks the other.
Right. That's not the case, because well, so first of all, we're not envisioning.
I mean, the gardens, right, the apartments over there.
Right.
And I would say, without too much equivocation, that most of the people who live right there.
Okay. No, the point is not to sort of build out a massive staff. We have a priest who has a lot of experience in campus ministry. She probably spends, maybe 25% of her time, if that, cultivating relationships with CSU. That's probably where we're going to stay. It's just naming that as a way of creating as many avenues to this space around us as we can. How do we care for the people who live 3 blocks away? That's in Trinity neighborhood partnerships. So that's what I think we should be doing as a church, because that's what it means to be the body of Christ. And I want us to absolutely strengthen that as well. I just don't see that we have to, I don't see that it's either or. It's about naming that is, I would call it a congregational ministry. That is a way that we are supposed to care for our neighbors. It's a way of resourcing both to the best of our ability. Brant.
Well, I was just thinking about how a lot of mission team, obviously, overlap.
Yes.
So the type of question is, when do you say that this is more? When do you say that's going to be a network among some?
Yeah.
And where I'm headed with that is, you know, when in the vision, when it said about commons are the center of communication,
Mhm.
as being sort of a peaceful wall. I was wondering whether that makes sense for that to be done in the mission, whether that has to be, you know, I don't know whether that means that being making sense as a mission team, whether it seems to be
That is a great question. And Brant asked, there's going to be a lot of overlap because ministries are not that cleanly, you know, discrete from one another. So when we're talking about networks, what is a network and what is a node and where are things shared? And then the second question was, where would Cathedral Commons go in the midst of that? And in my notes, there is number 8, which is Trinity Commons, which is not yet because it doesn't exist yet in this structure. But I would think that for it to function well, it would probably need to be mission team number 8. Because then you would have the staff member, you would have a vestry representative, but then you'd have input and guidance from this congregation as well. And that person, I mean, that's an example of maybe that's the people on that mission team are not all members of Trinity, because now you're looking actually, there's, you know, we could have people from the diocese who might have a role on a mission team, for example. But that allows, you can see that that would be something that connects to peace, justice, and mercy and spiritual formation. And well, why not children and youth? Why can't the Commons be a place of youth support as well, right? So that would probably be its own mission team and network. Marie, and then Gail. Yeah. Yeah, I heard a different story. We were, Marie. Yeah, it was because my understanding is that we were unable to get the financials crunched on time. That's right. Yeah, this is partly our financial structure now allows us to do that. We can't have audited because they won't have audited, but we checked with the controller and he feels pretty confident that we can do it by now. Now, in North Carolina, we got worried because like this always happened on Martin Luther King weekend. Here, this is a surprise, a little bit harder than we thought. So, we're working on that to add it could we're taking a look at what needs to be there to allow that. Yeah, Gail. I'm sorry. Who are the staff members? Oh, everybody.
one staff member with this one. Who are our staff?
I can't do that whole staff in this quick amount of time. Let me just tell you what each of these would be in our first draft. Let's look at the standing committees. Those would be led by vestry. Finance, the staff person would be the controller. Property, that would be facilities manager, Corrine. Stewardship, that would be, for now, communications director, and until such time as we have a development director. Cathedral Ministries is the associate rector. Looking at the mission teams, Peace, Justice, and Mercy, that would be me. Spiritual Formation, that would be Adrian. Trinity Neighborhood Partnerships, that would be Adrian. Congregational Life is Ginger. Invite, Welcome, Connect is Ginger. Children and Youth is the staff person we just announced. Worship, Art, and Music, that would be me and Todd.
I guess I wasn't looking for who are our staff members?
Right, I can provide, yeah, well, I would be happy to. I'm trying to think of the best way to get that information to you. It's just a list on the website. We have about 20 staff members. It's since we've only got 2 or 3 minutes, I can't go down the whole list, but yeah. So any concluding questions? All right, anything concluded from, and we have handed out in person this draft, and things can be changed, right? This is to bring it into conversation. What works, what doesn't work, what are we missing? Anything else from online? All right, thank you all very much. Well,